Chapter 28. The Black Night. The Chancellor looked around unhappily at the busy scene taking place in the grassy knolls which expanded out all around them. It had been a month since they'd heard word from Kane, but from what the Duke had told him, he would be arriving today. "Where is Terrawin?" asked the Chancellor grumpily, looking around amongst the crowd of busy workers searchingly. "The Viscount is otherwise indisposed, sir," replied Gertrude, rifling through her notes. "What could he possibly have going on that's more important than my event being hosted in his county?" asked the Chancellor angrily. "His aides sent a missive to the Duke regarding sporadic cattle mutilations around the county, sir," said Gertrude, narrowing her eyes as she read the missive. "Cattle mutilations? For crying out loud, why are we even in this ghastly gong-pit of a county?" asked the Chancellor, looking down at the ground and lifting his fancy academic regalia, lest they rest in anything undesirable. "Because I requested it," answered a voice from behind the Chancellor. He turned around, immediately feeling hatred well up in his throat when he saw who it was. "Rector!" exclaimed the Chancellor in surprise, looking at the fancy brigade of aides he was travelling with. The Chancellor was suddenly extremely self-conscious that he'd travelled here with Gertrude as his only aide. The Rector nodded his head smugly down at the Chancellor from his horse. "Graham," greeted the Rector distractedly. The Chancellor sucked his teeth. Addressing him by his first name. He'd already taken the back foot. He really needed to win back some ground here. "Well, Wulfgar, I must say I am surprised to see you so far away from your ivory tower. However will the library manage without you? You wouldn't want them to accidentally sort the books in reverse alphabetical order now, would you?" asked the Chancellor, placing a concerned hand over his mouth mockingly. He quietly revelled in his punchy delivery. He'd been rehearsing that one for weeks. "We use a numerical system, and it's rector synesige," replied the Rector, looking past him at the scene being organised around them. The Chancellor again felt hatred seething through his veins. This time he was really going to hit him where it hurt. "Quite the entourage you've brought along with you today. I can imagine you must have been feeling quite scared about travelling through the Common District. I myself only brought along my assistant Gertrude, for you see, I'm not afraid of being robbed by the common folk," said the Chancellor smugly. "Yes, I can't imagine you'd have reason to be," replied the Rector nonchalantly. Again the Chancellor felt a wave of loathing flow over him as his attack was so easily parried. "Why are you here?" asked the Chancellor, his polite facade falling slightly as his annoyance showed through in his tone. "That's privileged information, I'm afraid," replied the Rector with a bored sigh. "Why, you!" exclaimed the Chancellor for a moment before catching himself. He stopped and steadied his nerves. "I had suggested the military barracks as the location to host this event. They already have a full arena set up there as a permanent fixture. It's closer to Oxgate and features all of the amenities required to host a function such as this. Will you at least explain why you've chosen to change the location to this paddock?" asked the Chancellor, gesturing around in frustration at their agrarian surroundings. "No," replied the Rector flatly. The Chancellor opened and closed his mouth like a cod out of water. He stood in silence for a moment while he tried to process how angry this response had left him. "Perhaps I can shed some light on that," said a lone hooded man on a horse who had quietly approached them while they were talking. The man lifted up his baggy hood, revealing his handsome face and thick blonde locks of hair. "Prince Alexander!" exclaimed the Chancellor in surprise, immediately prostrating. The Prince held his hand out and made a motion for the Chancellor to stand back up. "Please, try to keep it down. I'm here incognito as I didn't want to cause a scene," explained the Prince, donning his hood again as he looked around anxiously. "Your Highness, preparations are coming along well," said the Rector, nodding his head politely. "Yes, I can see that. Well done to you both," said the Prince tactfully. The Chancellor bowed appreciatively, despite feeling like he'd done far more than the Rector in organising the event thus far. "Chancellor Headley, let me say that we did appreciate your idea of having the event be held in the military barracks. It was only upon discussions between the Duke, the Rector and myself that we discovered an issue. It was against the code of chivalry, and even my father's coronation oath, that one of those monsters be brought into Oxgate County. For this reason, Rector Sinisiege suggested we host the event here, in the Bleak Lands festival grounds instead," explained the Prince. The Chancellor nodded understandingly, indignation sweeping over him that he'd not been invited to this secret meeting of theirs. "I had interpreted that part of the code as meaning the walls of the city, not the entire county itself. My apologies," said the Chancellor, bowing his head. "Come now, we can't expect every potter and smithy in Oxgate to understand these matters so deeply now, can we? And please, Your Highness, call me Wulfgar," said the Rector, placing a hand over his chest and bowing politely. Before the Prince could respond, a horn suddenly sounded from nearby. "He's here!" exclaimed the Chancellor excitedly, looking towards the road behind the Prince. Sure enough, rolling down the road was an imposing brigade of knights. The brigade was led by none other than the Black Knight himself, Kane. His enormous jet-black Percheron stallion carried him at the front of the pack. He emitted an intimidating aura, his giant stature and long jet-black hair noticeable even from here. Behind him was a large brigade of intimidating-looking battle-hardened knights. They were from the Order of the Serpent, those who were responsible for keeping control of the treacherous desert surrounding the gate. Behind them, in the middle of the brigade, was a giant cube-shaped carriage covered by a canvas tarpaulin. The Chancellor swallowed nervously as he took in the impressive brigade, which had also clearly garnered the interest of the common folk of the Bleak Lands. A crowd of intrigued commoners had formed as the brigade had travelled through their county. They followed behind the rear-guarding knights, chattering excitedly amongst themselves. "He's really done it," said the Prince quietly. He adorned a concerned expression as he eyed off the covered carriage in the middle of the brigade. The Rector rode towards Kane, halting his horse on the side of the road as Kane approached. "Welcome home, Sir Kane. Congratulations on—" began the Rector. He may as well have been a part of the scenery. Kane didn't even bother glancing at the man as he led his brigade straight past him and towards the field that the Chancellor was still standing in beside the Prince. "Now hold on just a moment," exclaimed the Rector hurriedly as he became lost in the brigade of knights. The Prince reared his horse and slowly trotted towards Kane, pulling back his hood and shaking loose his signature blonde locks, revealing himself for all to see. As Kane approached the Prince, he finally drew his brigade to a halt, holding up a fist to signal a stop as he looked the Prince in the eyes. "Welcome home," said the Prince, nodding his head in greeting. "Where do you want it?" asked Kane flatly, doing away with any pleasantries. The Chancellor was shocked by his insolence. The Prince, on the other hand, seemed perfectly fine with Kane skipping the formalities, chuckling slightly even. The Prince turned his horse towards the Chancellor and raised an expectant eyebrow. The Chancellor suddenly realized that this was his cue. "Oh, yes, right this way, please," said the Chancellor, picking up his robe slightly and hurrying through the grassy field towards where the makeshift arena was being erected. The brigade followed him as he hurried his way through the mud with Gertrude by his side. "Why did we leave our horses in the town?" groaned the Chancellor in frustration. "You thought the festival grounds were in the town, sir," exclaimed Gertrude, beginning to become puffed out from their hurried rush through the field. "I knew exactly where the festival grounds were," lied the Chancellor, looking over his shoulder anxiously at the intimidating brigade in their wake to make sure nobody had overheard them. After a few minutes of walking, they finally arrived at the centre of the still under-construction arena. The wooden stands had mostly been erected by now. In design, it wasn't dissimilar to the kinds of arenas that would be erected for jousting tournaments. The standout feature was the large metal bar confines for the arena centre, which were currently being erected, separating the stands from the actual battleground. "In here, please," exclaimed the Chancellor, shooing any builders out of the way as he led the brigade into the arena's centre. He turned around to wait expectantly while the brigade filed in, and as he did, he was reminded of just how scary a man Kane actually was. Covered in scars and tattoos from head to toe, even his face was battle-worn. He had an enormous scar running from his forehead all the way down between his eyebrows and onto his left cheek. The Chancellor watched on nervously as the brigade of frightening knights gathered along the sides of the arena as the central carriage was brought to the far end of its centre. As soon as it drew to a halt, Kane and his knights dismounted and got to work detaching the enormous crate from its carriage before heaving it down onto the arena floor. "So, there's really, one of those things in there?" asked the Chancellor nervously, craning his head to see if he'd be able to catch a glimpse of the monster. After lowering the crate to the ground, Kane stood upright, turning to face the prince. "Anything else?" asked Kane, ignoring the Chancellor's question. The prince seemed to catch himself before responding, thinking deeply about something. "I'd like to see the beast," said the prince. Kane stared back at him blankly. "Sun's out." "They don't like that," replied Kane. The prince looked back at him with confusion on his face for a moment, clearly unsure of how this was relevant. "I need to see the beast so that I can confirm that you really have delivered upon what you were asked," said the prince, looking at Kane expectantly. After a moment of silence while the two men simply stared at each other, the rector dismounted his own steed and stepped forward. "Gentlemen, if I may," began the rector. "Fine," said Kane to the prince, ignoring the rector. He turned and walked back to his horse, withdrawing a lantern which he lit before turning back around to face the prince. "Come," he said simply. At first, the rector and the Chancellor stood back, watching as the prince and Kane began walking towards the crate. The two of them suddenly caught eye of one another, and regaining their respective composures, tentatively scurried forwards, trying to beat each other to catch up with the other two nobles. As the group approached the giant crate, Kane suddenly turned around. "Keep your hands away from the bars," said Kane, looking at all three men expectantly. Having finally had their presence acknowledged, the Chancellor and the rector nodded sagely. The prince also nodded, swallowing nervously. Some of Kane's knights brought over yet another canvas tarpaulin, extending it from the top of the crate down to the ground behind their small group. They'd have been immersed in darkness if not for Kane's lantern. Kane handed the lantern to the prince before turning around and beginning to untie some of the binds which were holding the canvas down around the crate. The moment that Kane lifted the corner of the canvas covering up, the Chancellor felt a chill of dread run down his spine. The monster looked exactly how it had been described. What really took the men by surprise was the fact that the beast immediately sprung into action. The moment that Kane appeared at the side of its enclosure, it scurried away to the far corner, curling up and covering its eyes from the light. The deep fear that the Chancellor had initially felt was suddenly replaced by a feeling of being underwhelmed. Is that it?" asked the rector, breaking the silence. Kane didn't bother answering, continuing to simply look at the prince expectantly. "Will this really be enough to send fear into the hearts of the common folk?" asked the prince, looking at the pathetic creature which had balled itself up in the corner of the enclosure. "I did what you asked of me," replied Kane enigmatically, simply continuing to stare at the prince, seemingly awaiting his cue so that they could leave. As an awkward silence started to overcome them, the Chancellor cleared his throat. "Well, I for one wouldn't want to be in the arena with such a beast." "You've done well, Kane," declared the Chancellor. "Yes, I can't imagine you would fare well," agreed the rector, gesturing towards the pathetic, quivering creature. The Chancellor glared at him hatefully for a moment before the Prince suddenly piped up again. "Speak candidly, please. As my old swordmaster, I want your opinion on the matter," said the Prince to Kane, who simply continued to stare back at him for a moment before responding. "Who is the fighter?" asked Kane. The Prince turned to the Chancellor expectantly. "Oh, he's—" began the Chancellor. "He's a commoner," interjected the Rector spitefully. "Unless you know the details, please let the Chancellor reply," said the Prince with a sigh. The Rector blushed as he realized that he'd overstepped the mark by interrupting. "Who is he?" reiterated Kane, staring directly at the Chancellor this time. "Well, yes, he is a commoner, a stable boy from Lacdorian," said the Chancellor, raising a judgmental eyebrow at the Rector. "How old?" asked Kane. "I believe he is 14 years old," replied the Chancellor with a nod. Kane turned to look at the monster for a moment. "Well?" asked the Prince, after an awkward silence had developed. "I think it's stupid," replied Kane flatly. The Chancellor gasped at Kane's blunt response, looking at the Prince and wanting to do some damage control, but not being able to find the words. "Quite," agreed the Rector, crossing his arms and nodding at Kane. The Prince looked a little dejected at hearing this. "Stupid why?" asked the Prince. "A commoner in the college," muttered the Rector under his breath. "I don't care about that," replied Kane, turning back to face them. "Any man entering the college should be able to defeat this thing. Look at it," said Kane, gesturing towards the monster. "They try to run and hide from us until their last breath. It's the only reason they've survived for so long," continued Kane. "Blessed with experience as you are, though, if you were setting your eyes on this thing for the first time, perhaps it wouldn't seem so stupid," suggested the Chancellor, unable to hold himself back from defending his well-planned event. Kane considered his words for a moment. "Perhaps, but hear me well. If this fight goes on long enough for that crowd to realize how pathetic this thing is, they will see straight through your farce," said Kane coldly. "I've kept this thing hungry for weeks, but you'd still best hope that this stable boy is as weak as you think he is. If the beast doesn't see him as prey, you won't even have a fight to watch," finished Kane. The Chancellor paled in realization of Kane's chilling words. Had he monumentally screwed up here? If William was able to intimidate this creature into submission, the entire event would be a failure. Not just a failure, but it would make the monsters appear weak and the knights even less necessary. Just what kind of mistake had he made here, and was William really as weak as the knights had told him that he was? Chapter 29. A Wolf in the Henhouse. "Any day now, boys," exclaimed Maud brightly, clearing the table where William and Eric were sharing an after-lunch pint. Eric smiled abashedly up at her, his anxiety showing a little on his face. "Not for me," said William with a sigh, swirling the dregs of his beer in his tankard. "Oh, come now, Willie, pluck up. I'm sure you'll get plenty of order invitations. Perhaps not the owl, but plenty of others," insisted Maud, raising an eyebrow. Despite having stayed here for over a month now, William and Eric still hadn't revealed to her that William was, in fact, the mystery combat trial fighter that the whole city was abuzz about. It would only worry her if she knew. Before William had a chance to respond, she suddenly gasped, looking down at Eric's plate, which was in her hand. "Eric, finish your carrots," commanded Maud, putting the plate back down in front of him and looking at him expectantly. Miss, I'm not so hungry," admitted Eric, reluctantly reaching for the remaining carrots on his plate and stuffing them into his mouth to appease her. "Next time I'll tell Sir Ivar that you're wasting his money," threatened Maud. "It's just because of these stupid exam results. Eric's getting pretty anxious about it all," added William, earning a sigh from Eric. They understood what was happening in William's case, but mysteriously Eric was also still to receive any offers. Dame Azalea had said she'd look into it for him, but he hadn't heard back from her in days. "I don't care. The boy's going to waste away if he doesn't eat properly. Look at him. He's half the size he was when he arrived here," exaggerated Maud, reclaiming the now empty plate. Eric had been joining in on William's training every day, so naturally his fitness had been improving. Compared to his previous diet, which had consisted almost solely of pork and bread he'd prepared for himself, the more well-rounded meals provided by the Blue Lantern had lost him some weight since staying there. It was still certainly a wild exaggeration to say that he was wasting away, however. "I did have a few pounds to spare, you know," responded Eric through his mouthful of carrots. "Seeing you getting smaller every day doesn't send the right message about my food to the other patrons," exclaimed Maud, pointing a fork at him threateningly before turning away back towards the kitchen. The two boys chuckled. They had grown quite close to the staff at the Blue Lantern since they'd been staying here. Maud and Gerald felt more like an uncle and aunt of theirs than strangers at this point. Albeit temporary, the warm atmosphere had led the two of them to actually manage to fall into somewhat of a comfortable lifestyle. The more comfortable William became, however, the more he yearned to send a missive to Sasha back in Lacdorian. He was desperate to see if she was okay and to let her know that he was alive. Eric had explained to him countless times by now that any missive he sent would surely be intercepted by Wilton and would potentially make Sasha's situation worse. It could even bring authorities searching for William if Wilton knew where he was. All William could do was be thankful that his aunt and uncle were there to provide support for his sister and try to forget how traumatized and alone she must feel. The last she saw of William, he was galloping off into the storm with a monster chasing him. As far as she knew, her whole family was dead, and nobody believed her story. William's rumination was suddenly interrupted by a commotion brewing out on the street. As they walked over to the window and peered out curiously, their eyes widened at what they saw. There was a unit of the biggest, scariest knights that either boy had ever seen in their lives. Each member of the crew was larger and more intimidating than the last, everyone wearing black gear bearing a green sigil of a menacing, open-mouthed snake. They were all battle-scarred, tattooed, and riding enormous war horses. The scariest member of the group by far was a man of immense stature with long black hair leading at the front of the pack on a giant black Percheron warhorse. "Who are they?" asked William in awe. "I don't know for sure, but that guy at the front? I think that might be Kane," said Eric, swallowing nervously. William's eyes opened wide in fear. If Kane was here, that could only mean one thing. So was the monster. The knights had told him that Kane, the fabled knight of legend, would be the one bringing the creature. Until that moment, William had thought that Kane might just be a fairy tale parents told their children to get them to stop worrying about the gateway. "I thought Kane was the head of the goats' order hall. Why does he have a snake on his crest?" asked William as he assessed the menacing knight approaching them. "Aye, he is the head of the goats, but he's also in charge of the Vipers. The Vipers aren't actually an order. They're just a group of knights that work out in the desert," answered Eric distractedly. The midday patrons of the inn had immediately started moving away from the door, some tipping their hat and evacuating the building altogether. Before William and Eric had decided what to do, the brigade had begun to dismount in front of the Blue Lantern. "Why are they coming here?" asked William. "Shh! You boys stay quiet. This lot are dangerous. Stay out of their way," warned Maud, straightening her outfit and taking a deep breath as she prepared to greet the guests. William and Eric nodded obediently, retreating back to their corner table where they'd been eating their lunch, and waited anxiously. A moment later the front door of the inn burst open and Kane strode his way in. "Welcome to the Blue Lantern," greeted Maud politely, curtsying at the brigade of enormous knights. They ignored her, walking straight past her and following Kane deeper into the inn. He took his seat at the head of a table facing the door. He pulled a dagger from his belt and began absent-mindedly playing with it while the rest of his troop filed in and filled up empty chairs around the inn. The existing patrons who had elected to remain in the tavern drew their conversations to a stop, watching on anxiously as the brigade of vipers entered their nest. "What can I—" began Maud after sharing a concerned glance with her husband behind the bar. "Drink. Food." "Whores," answered voices from the brigade, all watching her expectantly. "Drinks coming up," answered Gerald, beginning to fill tankard after tankard with ale. "And I'll get the kitchen to start preparing you some food," answered Maud, beginning to hurry off towards the kitchen. "Whores?" asked Cain, stopping the twisting of his dagger for a moment and looking up at the retreating Maud expectantly. She stopped in her tracks and cleared her throat awkwardly, sharing a concerned glance with her husband. "You've been gone for quite a while, sir. It's not that kind of establishment since we've taken over, I'm afraid," she answered nervously. The knights immediately started murmuring amongst themselves, displeased with the news. "I suppose he'll have to do," said one of the female knights sitting at the bar, running a hand down Gerald's arm. William and Eric sat up straight in their chairs, extremely discomforted by the scene unfolding around them. Maud looked like she wanted to come to her husband's aid, but he shook his head and nodded towards the kitchen. She nodded in return and quickly hurried back there. "You heard her." "Ain't that kind of place since we took over," said Gerald, removing the viper's hand and continuing to line up the tankards on the bar. "Oh, but you're so my type," said the knight, slumping her shoulders and staring him in the eyes. A few of the vipers exchanged chuckles. "If there aren't any whores, then I'm—" began one of the knights standing by the entrance, before suddenly he was interrupted as the door was kicked open, slamming straight into his face. In the doorway appeared Sir August, standing there with his hands on his hips and a giant keen grin plastering his face. He took a step forward and looked straight at Cain. "Cain!" bellowed Sir August, grinning from ear to ear and raising an eyebrow as he stared down at the Black Knight. "What the—" cried out the knight, who had been clobbered in the face by the door, shining red with fury and approaching August angrily. "You've finally returned," continued August, still not having noticed what he'd done. The angry viper took a furious step towards August, balling up his fist and pulling back his arm to strike. Before William could shout out to warn August, the viper had launched his attack. As the viper's fist flew towards the side of August's head, he caught it with an open hand, stopping him in his tracks. William was in awe that he seemed to have been able to do this using peripheral vision alone. Now, said August, turning his head to face the viper and raising an eyebrow. The viper angrily pulled his arm back, tensing up furiously but seeming to be too intimidated by August's fast reflexes to attempt striking at him again. "You hit me with the door," growled the knight, immediately seeming to realize how childish he sounded in this room full of mighty warriors. "Oh, I did? Sorry about that, mate," apologized August jovially, slapping the man playfully on the arm. "So, the lion lives," said Cain, stopping his knife twisting and looking up at August. "Indeed," answered August cheerfully. "It had been so long since I'd heard any stories of your deeds, I had assumed that you were dead," said Cain, looking back down at his dagger distractedly. August erupted into hearty laughter. "Well, I could really say the same about you. Surely those creatures in the desert aren't enough to keep you lot busy?" asked August, looking around the room searchingly. The knights all murmured, straightening up in their chairs. "There's more going on in that desert than those things, you know," said Cain cryptically, snatching his dagger back off the table and putting it into his belt. "Of course. Still, I can imagine that bringing one of them here was no easy feat." "Well done," replied August earnestly, looking around the room at all of the knights. He suddenly noticed William and Eric at their corner table. "Oh, and there he is, the very boy who will be facing the beast," said August, gesturing to William and Eric. The two boys waved back coyly as they suddenly found the entire room staring at them. Cain abruptly stood from his chair. "Which one?" asked Cain. "William," said Sir August, pointing at William. A smirk suddenly appeared on Kane's face as he looked William up and down. "Maybe the fight will be worth watching after all," said Kane, earning a chuckle from his compatriots. William didn't quite understand what he meant, so decided to stay quiet. "Don't underestimate the boy," said Sir August, raising an eyebrow. Kane suddenly stopped in his tracks, genuinely reassessing William. It seemed like August's opinion had actually swayed Kane's judgment a little. "We'll see," said Kane, gesturing with his head towards the door that he and his fellow knights should leave. "Your drink, sir?" asked Gerald, gesturing to the line of tankards waiting on the bar. Kane ignored him as the Black Knights began filing out of the inn. "Ain't no point if you got no whores," replied one of the Vipers as the group exited the building. August shook his head as he watched them leaving. "Richard," said August sternly when Kane was the last knight left in the room, suddenly causing him to stop in his tracks. "See your boy while you're here," said August seriously. Kane stayed still for a moment without turning around before continuing out the door and closing it behind him. There was a long moment of silence in the bar before Maud suddenly burst out from the kitchen. "William!" exclaimed Maud, angrily pointing a wooden spoon at him as she rushed to Gerald's side. William stared back at her nervously, not sure what he'd done to garner her ire. "You're not really involved with that nonsense down in the Bleaklands, are you?" she asked, as her husband silently reassured her that he was fine. Eric and William exchanged a nervous glance before William let out a sigh. "Aye," confirmed William ashamedly. August looked between the two of them in confusion. "He'll be facing off against Kane's monster. Do you need tickets? I can get you seats," offered August, missing her tone entirely. "This is what you've been training him for?" yelled Maud at August angrily, whipping him with her towel. "Yes," exclaimed August merrily in response. "How could you? Look at him! He's... stammered Maud, catching herself before she finished her sentence. William let out a frustrated sigh. "I'm not even that small, you know," said William defensively. "Oh, I know, sweetheart, it's just... I wouldn't let either of my boys near that thing, not even my eldest," she explained. William felt his heart warmed that her motherly instincts were kicking in on his behalf. "Oh, don't worry, I've trained him well. He's more than capable enough of defeating the thing, I can assure you of that. I've sparred against him and slain some of those things myself, so I should know," said August, beginning to walk towards the door. Maud seemed a little reassured by his words. "Well, you be careful upsetting those Black Knights too. They're dangerous," warned Maud as August was reaching for the door. He nodded appreciatively to her, waving goodbye to the boys as he left. Maud let out a deep sigh as she looked at the tankards lined up on the countertop and began quietly discussing matters with her husband. William felt anxiety churning in his stomach. If Kane was here, that meant the fight could happen any day now. Had Kane been right? Was William really going to lose? Every time he'd told August he was worried, August had reassured him that he'd win if he just mastered the basics of swordsmanship. After seeing the most famous knight in the kingdom doubt him, however, Will couldn't help but feel worried that Kane was right. Had William bitten off more than he could chew here, or would August's training be enough? The second that the prince entered the room, he knew this was not going to be an easy conversation. His father was clearly not in a particularly receptive mood, but Alexander needed to report back to him anyway. The king was playing with what appeared to be some kind of exotic kitten, dangling a toy above it and watching it prancing about after the feather on a string. Alexander glanced over at his younger brother, who was sitting in the corner on a fancy sofa looking incredibly bored. He was shelling some rare foreign nuts. After shelling each nut, he'd toss the shell towards one of the stationary guards on duty, seeing if he could make it ricochet off his helmet and into a nearby vase. Alexander closed his eyes and let out a sigh. "Stop that, Edward," said Alexander as he entered the room. His brother simply rolled his eyes and continued throwing the nuts at the guard, who looked quite uncomfortable with the whole affair. "Oh, let the boy have his fun," said the king, not taking his eyes off of the kitten he was playing with. "That man is a knight, not an ornament. He deserves your respect," stated Alexander, again imploring his brother to stop. Once more Edward ignored him, staring him in the eyes as he threw a nut directly into the knight's face to prove a point. "Look what the Zerubians have gifted to me. They're only found in Zerubia. Isn't it positively wonderful?" asked his father, continuing to ignore Edward's antics. Alexander let out a sigh, turning back to the king and nodding his head. "Yes, quite charming indeed," answered Alexander, glancing back over his shoulder at his brother's activity before his father let out a grumble. "Do at least try to fool me by feigning a little interest," said the king without looking up from the cat. Alexander looked down at the small black and white striped kitten rolling about on the smooth royal tiles of the throne room. He rubbed his face tiredly. "Yes, please forgive me, father. It's lovely. I've had a very long day. I have only just arrived here from the Bleaklands. I bring news of the combat trial, which I wish to discuss with you," said Alexander, looking at his father expectantly. His father's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked up at Alexander and opened his mouth to say something before catching himself and looking around towards a corridor to the left of the room. He clapped his hands twice, and a Zerubian aide ran to his side. "Yes, your highness?" asked the lady politely. "Bring me I forget what it's called. That queer mask of yours," he requested excitedly. Alexander felt his spirits drop the moment he realized that his father hadn't listened to a word he'd said. The aide hurried off around a corner. "Okay, so, father," began Alexander, before the king held up a finger for him to wait. Alexander rubbed his forehead tiredly as he waited for his father to be done with this train of thought. After a moment his aide returned, holding a large wooden tribal mask. She handed it to the king, bowing respectfully before taking her leave once more. "Look at it," said his father, chuckling at its design. He held it over his face, dancing about in his throne. "Ooga booga!" he exclaimed, laughing hysterically at himself. The prince feigned a smile at his father's antics. "It's a very nice artifact, father." "Very nice indeed," said Alexander. "Isn't it?" asked his father in response, putting the mask back down in his lap and inspecting it adoringly. "I take it that your relations with the Zerubians are as strong as ever?" asked Alexander, realizing that if he wanted to get his father to engage in a conversation, he'd have to use mention of his beloved distant kingdom as bait. "Oh, yes, swimmingly," chirped the king brightly, straightening up in his chair. He suddenly let out a mournful sigh. "Why is it that we can't be bordered with them? We've pompous Castellians to our south, useless cave-dwelling brutes to our north, and that cursed desert and its sand-folk to the east. If only our ancestors had taken the opportunity the Gateway had provided them with. They could have taken Castelia when such things were less scorned. We'd be but a canal away from Zerubia," said the king, drifting off deep into thought. Alexander realized he was on the verge of losing him again. "Yes, a fabulous observation, father. Talking of the Gateway," began Alexander. "Father, can I leave yet?" asked Edward suddenly, throwing his final handful of nuts straight at the guard with no particular target in mind. "My sweet boy, you're here to witness how I keep our kingdom running. This is important. You're getting older. You're of a squire's age now. You need to start learning about these things," replied their father, smiling adoringly at his youngest son. "What things? Neither of you are saying anything useful," shouted Edward. Alexander let out a groan of annoyance. "Father, can I please just tell you about the progress of the combat trial so that we can all go?" asked Alexander, frustrated. His father raised a judgmental eyebrow. You may be my son, but you're still talking to your king. Watch your tone, warned his father. Alexander immediately bowed his head. You are right. Please forgive me, father. As I said, it's been a long day, replied Alexander. An awkward silence formed before his father let out a bored groan. Fine, out with it then. What news do you have? Asked the king, leaning back lazily in his throne and giving a loose-wristed gesture for Alexander to hurry up. Cain has arrived with the monster, and progress on the Bleaklands festival grounds is coming along nicely. It should be ready for the event to be held on schedule next week, informed Alexander, thankful to finally be given the opportunity to share his message. Next week, piped up Edward suddenly, jumping up from his chair. He walked over angrily towards his brother and father. That's my birthday, yelled Edward furiously. Prince Alexander and the king exchanged a confused glance. I forbid this. I forbid it, shouted Edward, stomping his feet furiously. My dear boy, this won't interrupt your birthday. If anything, it will make your birthday even more extravagant. We can declare this part of the festivities, suggested the king. Edward shook his head furiously. Have you forgotten, father? I'll be on a hunting trip. My friends won't want to come if that combat trial is happening, yelled Edward. Oh, of course they would. Nobody would miss your party for the world, reasoned the king. You can always come to the trial for your birthday instead, suggested Alexander. His brother stared at him hatefully. I don't care about that stupid trial. I have the whole trip planned. I've already told Eamon and everyone. How would it look if I changed it all now? Asked Edward, looking between his father and his brother searchingly. Edward, please do try to be reasonable, began Alexander. No, you'll have to delay the trial, decreed Edward, crossing his arms with a huff. But my sweet boy, we can't delay the trial. The college semester will be starting the week after next. Next week is the final time that the trial can be held, reasoned the king. Well, we're scheduled to head up to the lodge the day after tomorrow, so you'll have to hold it tomorrow, decreed Edward categorically. It can't be held tomorrow. It's not ready. I've just come from the arena. They've only just begun assembling the barricades. The safety of the audience must be our #1 priority, explained Alexander. The king stared between his two sons deep in thought for a moment. The way that Duke Archimond explained things to me, this creature merely looks frightening. It is in fact quite docile, yes? Asked the king. Alexander nodded reluctantly, remembering seeing the monster curled up in the corner of its crate. His father suddenly clapped his hands together. Very well then, the event will be held tomorrow, he exclaimed, hopping up from his throne. Alexander looked between his brother and father, exasperatedly. The arena won't be finished by then, reasoned Alexander. As long as it looks sturdy, that's good enough. If the creature is as docile as I've been told, then proper precautions need not be taken anyway. There will be plenty of knights in attendance. Those vipers are about, yes? Send them along. That should be safety enough. If it weren't, then I'd simply declare that the dissidents were clearly correct, reduce the college's funding, and cancel the event altogether, explained his father, clapping his hands twice for his aide to come back in. But, father, began Alexander. Enough. The event will be held tomorrow, and your brother will have his birthday uninterrupted, decreed the king, handing the mask back to his aide. Honestly, Alexander, the gateway has been closed for a century anyway. Whatever happens to the college, I can always find other ways to import foreign talent to our kingdom. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must prepare for dinner, said the king, wandering away down a hallway and out of the throne room. There was a moment of awkward silence as Alexander processed how little his father truly seemed to grasp the importance of the college. You're not invited, by the way, piped up Edward, breaking the silence before turning away and leaving the room. Alexander shook his head and let out a deep sigh as he watched the housekeepers hurry into the room and begin sweeping up all of the nuts his brother had left on the floor. Would it really be okay for the event to be held tomorrow? Would it really be okay to not have proper safety precautions? His father had a point. The monster was supposed to be quite weak. Cain had told them as much. But if that were the case, why did Alexander have a feeling of unease churning in his gut over the whole affair? Chapter 30. The Day of the Trial. There she was, a dark presence in the corner, again. He felt his breathing intensifying. He tried to close his eyes, but found himself, of course, unable to. He tried his best, but no matter how hard he tried, the word wouldn't come out. Anne-Marie took a step closer to his bed. Suddenly the visions flashed before his eyes. There she was, being dragged by her legs out the door, with her hands clawing at the doorframe and her nails breaking as she tried feebly to resist their pull. "Heinrich!" she screamed desperately, staring him in his eyes. Just like that, she was abducted away into the night, taken to that unspeakable place. He snapped back to reality, trying his best to scream, but all that came out was a dull whimper. Anne-Marie stepped closer, right up to the end of his bed. He struggled to lift himself up, but he couldn't move a muscle. She placed her hands on his legs. Again he tried to scream for help, but all that came out was a dull groan. Her insidious intent was clear as she crawled her way on top of him, dragging herself up his body slowly. No, he stammered, putting every inch of his willpower into trying to move a muscle, but it was no use. He was completely paralyzed. He knew what came next. He wriggled and squirmed, trying to scream at the top of his lungs, but expelling nothing but hot air. He couldn't see it again. He couldn't. As Anne-Marie dragged herself over him, sitting on his chest, she bent down, staring him in his eyes. Her face was full of pure hatred and malice. Here it was. Right on cue, the vision suddenly flashed before his eyes, and once again he was taken to that awful place. The place where his great-grandmother had been taken. A swirling red mist, a choir of anguish, the squeals of joy and the cries of horror, a putrid carpet of gore, old and fresh, layers of despair, a mountain of flesh, Neapolitan, stapled glottises silent and overflowing, pithed and flayed they suffered, glabrous scalps and splintered stubs, avulsed and burst, they flumped and floundered. A terrified saccade neath cherry-clogged lids, furred, congested, peeled, nerve knots emitted an ebullition of thick crimson waste. Though scorched, they shivered, scarred and seared, forced to live and doomed to die. Coerced emulsions intermingled, new life and death cursed in sordid variegation. Among the fertile horror, his screams adorned the ambience. Unseeable, unspeakable, unthinkable. He screamed. Eric was suddenly shaken awake. The first thing he heard was his own voice, still wailing in horror. "Eric!" exclaimed William, continuing to shake him. Eric grabbed onto William's arm, catching his breath as he shot up in bed, looking all around himself as he regained his bearings. "Eric, it's okay. I'm here," said William, looking him in the eyes searchingly. Eric continued to cling onto him for dear life as the visions faded and reality cascaded back over him. I'm okay," murmured Eric, swallowing between panicked breaths. William shook his head as he looked over his friend with concern. "Eric, this is getting a little scary," said William, drooping his shoulders slightly. Eric nodded his head understandingly, taking a deep breath and steadying himself. "Aye, William, it's just anxiety. Over the exams," lied Eric, dodging William's searching gaze. "Is that really all it is?" asked William distrustfully. Eric floundered for a response for a moment before William let out a sigh. "It's okay, Eric. I know you're worried about my fight. You can tell me. I won't be offended," said William, blushing slightly. Eric let out a deep breath, tracing William's train of thought. It was better than the truth. William would never sleep beside him if he knew how the monster had been tormenting him, but Eric needed to watch over him. He needed to keep William safe. He needed to keep everybody safe. Before Eric could respond, there was suddenly an urgent knock on their door that startled both of the boys. William hopped up and unlatched the door. Immediately he was taken aback by the large collection of individuals standing in the hallway. Among the group were the 3 knights, each wearing an expression of concern, even Ivar. He and Azalea were also notably carrying their full armaments with them. Among them was also Cain, who was standing further down the hallway, looking as tired and angsty as always. Maud was there too, with Gerald's arm over her shoulder, reassuring her. At the very front of the door there was a tall, pale man with black hair in a pompous, well-groomed bob. He was adorned with extremely fancy burgundy robes and an extravagant hat. Beside him was the man that William recognized as the Chancellor of the college from the exam day. "Is this him?" asked the Chancellor, looking William up and down before turning to the knights curiously. Azalea nodded her head. "He's perfect!" exclaimed the tall man, clasping his hands together excitedly. Eric looked out of the window of their room. It looked like it was barely sunrise. What were all of these people doing here? The Chancellor suddenly cleared his throat. "William Lackdorian, we are here to escort you to your combat trial," announced the Chancellor. The slender man also cleared his throat. "Yes, quite," he agreed, unnecessarily. William gawked blankly at the crowd of important individuals before him. "What?" he blurted. Eric approached William's side, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Talk of the town has been that the arena preparations have only just begun," said Eric, looking distrustfully at the crowd before him. "Begone, meddlesome boy! This is none of your concern," shooed the tall man to Eric. The Chancellor raised an eyebrow at him. "Well, Mr. Rothmane," began the Chancellor, turning with a sly grin on his face as he watched the slender man's face drop suddenly as he realized who Eric was. "The situation has changed. By royal decree, the event is to be held tonight. The Rector may be correct that this is not your business. However, given the circumstances, I think it should be fine for you to accompany young William for the journey if you see it necessary," suggested the Chancellor, turning to the rest of his party, who all nodded in agreement. Eric stared at the Rector in stunned silence for a moment. "I'm ready," said William. Eric turned to him in surprise. "William, are you sure about this?" asked Eric. William let out a shaky breath. "It's about time. Look how worried you are. How worried Maud is. It's time to get this over with. What choice do I have anyway?" asked William. Eric wanted to reassure him, but there was little he could really say. William was right. Whether the fight was today or next week, it didn't make much of a difference. He let out a sigh, patting William on the shoulder. "Aye, let's do this," he agreed. "May we please adorn our robes?" asked Eric to the Chancellor. He nodded understandingly. "I'll allow it," inserted the Rector, and with that the day of the trial began. As William and Eric hurriedly donned their college robes, anxiety and panic began to fill Eric's chest. Was William really ready for this? Was it really going to be okay? Had Sir August's training really been enough? As their carriage trundled down the familiar bumpy road, William stared in awe at the arena, still in the process of being erected. "Is that really going to be ready by tonight?" asked Eric as he too stared out the window, captivated by the scene which was abuzz with builders and planners hurrying about in every direction. "Of course it will be," assured the Rector. William shot Eric a concerned glance. Both of them had helped out with enough construction work to see how shoddy the workmanship on the arena was. It actually gave William a little bit of hope that perhaps they were expecting the monster to put up as little of a fight as Sir August had suggested it would. The carriage suddenly drew to a halt as they arrived at the outer edge of the arena. "I'm afraid this is where the three of us will be disembarking. Security and performers only beyond this point," said the Chancellor, standing up from his seat. William looked around in confusion, half standing up from his chair, as he was unsure of exactly what this meant. "You're a performer," said the rector dryly, seeing William's confusion. "I can stay with him though, right?" asked Eric. The Chancellor shook his head. "I'm afraid not. This is as far as you come," he explained, beckoning for Eric to follow him out of the carriage. Eric turned back to William, casting him a concerned glance. William gave him a confident smile and nodded his head reassuringly. "It's all right. I'll be okay," said William. Eric shook his head, his face plastered with worry. "Listen, remember everything that Sir August taught you. Keep your guard up, react according to its fighting style. He said that it's best if these things are kept on the defensive," said Eric. William held his hand up, interrupting him. "Aye, I'll remember," said William with a smile. "Hurry now, Rothmane," said the rector from outside the carriage. Eric looked back at Will, catching him in a tight hug. William laughed, reciprocating the melodramatic show of affection from Eric. When he caught sight of Kane sitting in the corner of the carriage, staring judgmentally, he immediately broke the hug. "Just be careful, all right?" implored Eric. William nodded understandingly as Eric began to back away out of the carriage. "Eric," said William suddenly, stopping him in his tracks. "If this is the last time I see you," he began. "It won't be," interrupted Eric assuredly. William smiled and nodded his head. "Aye, but thanks for everything," said William earnestly. Eric stayed silent and simply nodded his head in response before turning away and disappearing out of the carriage. For a moment, William had drifted off into thought, remembering the trials and tribulations the two boys had been through, before he suddenly made eye contact with Kane again and cleared his throat nervously. "So, the lion's been training you?" asked Kane curiously. William nodded awkwardly. "Yes, sir," confirmed William. Kane seemed to ponder this as their carriage started moving again. "Get it over with quickly, then," he said, after a few moments of silence. William looked at him in surprise, watching as the Black Knight continued to stare out of the window silently. Did Kane really think that the small amount of training that he'd gotten from Sir August was enough to tip the fight so much in his favour? Just how weak was this monster? A little confidence suddenly found its way into William's heart. The one thing that had previously given him doubt had been Kane's words in the Blue Lantern. With that put to rest, there was nothing left holding him back from being focused and ready for the fight. He took a deep breath, looking out of his window as they slowly rolled towards their destination. This was it. Today was the day. Before the night ended, either him or that monster were going to be left standing alone in that arena. All he had to do was make sure that it was him. Eric watched the scene as it became busier and busier. How had he managed to get himself included in such a cohort? He was surrounded by important people, all in a hectic rush to ensure that preparations would be made by tonight. He sat with a pewter cup of juice in his hand, the only person in the scene who was still stationary. "Where is Terowin?" demanded the rector furiously. "He still hasn't arrived, sir," answered one of his aides. "What could he possibly have going on that's more important than this?" asked the rector, looking around at his aides expectantly. They all stared back blankly, wanting to provide an answer, but having none. As he shuffled awkwardly on his seat, Eric suddenly realized that he could feel a weight in his robe pocket. He reached in, feeling for whatever he'd accidentally brought along when he'd hurriedly put on his robes this morning. After a moment he found the culprit, pulling out his great-grandfather's trinket and inspecting it curiously. It had a dull warmth to it, feeling more like it had been sitting in the sun than simply being in his pocket. He ran his thumb along its intricate design as he tried to take his mind off of worrying about the fight. They wouldn't let him pass the barricades to see William, but even if they would, what more could he say? Eric was suddenly pulled from his thoughts when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "What have you got there?" asked Azalea with a warm smile. She sat down at the chair next to him, sipping at a pewter cup of juice of her own. Eric let out a sigh, looking back down at his great-grandfather's trinket. "Just a family heirloom," said Eric without looking up. Azalea nodded absent-mindedly, looking over the bustling preparation area and taking a sip from her cup. "Listen, Rothmane, I've been meaning to talk with you. I looked into your exam results and order offers like we'd discussed, and it seems that your results were exceptional to say the least. Perhaps the highest score I've ever seen, actually. Very well done," said Azalea. "Thank you," replied Eric quietly, his mind a million miles away. "So, you've probably received an offer from pretty much every order we've got. Heck, I sent you an offer from the Order of the Fox myself. I spoke with the Chancellor, and he told me that there's been a complication with your offers, but that they will come through eventually. So just keep holding out for now, yeah?" asked Azalea. Eric nodded his head. With William on the cusp of his battle, little else mattered to him right now. What would it matter which order he got into if William was dead? Azalea looked at him silently with an expression of concern for a moment. "Look, Rothmane, I never had a chance to talk to you about this, but August told us about what happened to your friend," said Azalea. Eric felt a sudden sense of dread come over him. He was used to William getting his hackles up when Anne-Marie was discussed. At this point, he'd been conditioned to feel defensive simply by hearing her mentioned. "Anne-Marie," replied Eric with a sigh, putting the trinket back in his pocket. "Yes, Anne-Marie," said Azalea, looking away and taking a sip from her cup. "I was taken with her the moment I set eyes on her. She was such a sweet girl, brave too. Nobody else in that village had the gall to approach us, except for you two, of course," said Azalea with a smile. Eric closed his eyes and nodded. "Aye, she was brave," he agreed quietly. "Good through and through too. And such a hard worker. She was always willing to lend a helping hand." "Always smiling," thought Eric aloud, sinking deep into bittersweet reflection on the girl whose memory the monster had been working hard to tarnish. Azalea suddenly placed her hand on his knee, sending a jolt of surprise through him and pulling his mind back to the present. He looked up to meet her eyes, seeing a face racked with emotion. "Listen, I never thought he'd touch her," said Azalea, blushing slightly. Eric didn't know how to respond. "We'd been traveling with him for a week before we arrived in Lacdorian. The man barely had the energy to even stand on his own. We just never imagined that she was in any danger with him," reasoned Azalea. Eric shook his head. "It's no excuse," replied Eric. For a moment Azalea seemed to want to protest, but then caught herself and nodded in agreement. "Yes, I suppose you're right," she agreed quietly. "Look, I just wanted to say that began Azalea. Eric held his hand up. "It's no excuse for me either. I was there. I left her alone with him too. I'm not the one you need to be apologizing to," said Eric, nodding towards the sealed doors leading to the performers' area where William was housed. Azalea nodded understandingly, following his gaze. A ruckus suddenly broke out as a middle-aged man with a goatee and fancy moustache burst onto the scene. "Viscount Terowin!" exclaimed the rector, garnering the attention of the many individuals around the waiting area who all hurried over towards the newly arrived Viscount. Seeing the avalanche of responsibility coming his way, the Viscount immediately began making a hasty retreat. "Where have you been?" interrogated the rector angrily to Terowin as he backed away. He let out an exasperated sigh. "There have been more cattle deaths. I needed to investigate it myself, answered the Viscount, straightening up and continuing to try to catch his breath as he was swarmed by people wanting his attention. How could that possibly take precedence over this event? Asked the rector, struggling to be heard over the sea of people asking questions of their own. Because this time they were my bloody cows, cried the Viscount furiously as he was swept away by the crowd. The rector sucked his teeth and turned around, seeing that Eric was staring at him. Mind your business, Rothmane, said the rector spitefully. Eric was about to acquiesce before suddenly a thought occurred to him. Sir, may I please ask you a question? Asked Eric suddenly, taking the rector by surprise. What? Do you have some kind of ancient footnote to a bylaw that dictates I must stand on one foot while addressing a Viscount? Asked the rector, clearly still spiteful that Eric had essentially choreographed this entire combat trial by himself. Azalea giggled, but caught herself, bringing her pewter cup back up to her mouth and averting her eyes. No, sir. I have a question about the gateway creatures, said Eric, catching the rector off guard. The rector cleared his throat and stood upright, clearly proud to be addressed as an authority on this secret information. Fear not. I've heard of the plan to keep your little friend alive. I wouldn't worry too much about the creature, said the rector, surprisingly earnestly. Eric was taken aback to hear that the rector was aware of the plan of not letting William actually die, but he did suppose that having a child die on their watch would likely be just as bad of an image for the college as if William actually won. Actually, sir, my question is about the language written on the gateway, said Eric. Immediately, Azalea choked on her juice, erupting into a coughing fit. The rector looked shocked beyond belief. How in the world do you know about that? Asked the rector, flabbergasted by Eric's question. I was just wondering whether the knights of old had used that language for some reason, and if so, whether I might be allowed to research it in your library, asked Eric, swallowing nervously as he realized how awfully close he was treading to likely asking about forbidden knowledge. The rector stared open-mouthed at Eric for a moment before closing his eyes and shaking his head to gather himself. Azalea managed to finally stop coughing, now joining the rector in staring at Eric in disbelief. Boy, if your family has kept forbidden materials from the Dark Ages, then began the rector. Eric immediately shook his head. No, sir, I was told of this by a travelling gypsy, said Eric, remembering back to what William had told him about his conversation with the old gypsy man. The rector shared an uneasy glance with Azalea. Listen, boy, forget the nonsense that Gypsy told you. It's just gypsy trickery, said the rector, looking away from Eric and straightening his robes. But, sir, began Eric. Enough! I want to go the rest of my days without hearing any more of your old-world nonsense. Do you understand me? Asked the rector furiously. Eric nodded. Yes, sir, replied Eric politely. The rector looked satisfied with his response. If you have any other questions pertaining to your curriculum, I suggest you chase them up with your chancellor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to, said the rector, spinning around and trotting off with his chin raised haughtily. Eric let out a defeated sigh. He sat in thought for a moment before he felt a punch to his shoulder. That was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, said Azalea seriously. Eric nodded his head understandingly. I know, said Eric, looking down into his juice deep in thought. Did you really hear about that from a gypsy? Asked Azalea. Eric looked up and realized she was staring at him with an expression of utmost concern. Do you know something about it? Parried Eric, catching Azalea off guard. She averted her gaze, her cheeks flushing red. Dame Azalea, please, is there anything you can tell me about that language? Asked Eric. Azalea shook her head, a pained expression appearing on her face. There is nothing more dangerous in this world, Rothmane. Never mention that language ever again. Not to a soul. Of all the forbidden knowledge, that language is the most forbidden that there is. The only reason I know anything about it at all is because I've been to the gateway myself, and She suddenly caught herself, sucking her teeth in frustration that she'd overshared. Eric stared at her intently, captivated by her words. "So, it is written on the gateway," thought Eric aloud, intrigued. Azalea stood up and shook her head. "I told you to drop it, Rothmane. This isn't a game. To think that you'd ask the rector himself," said Azalea incredulously, letting out a dumbfounded laugh at his audacity. "Listen, there's a reason this knowledge is forbidden. Trust me. Don't mention it to anyone ever again. Not even to me," warned Azalea, before turning around and beginning to leave. Eric leaned back in his chair, once again withdrawing his great-grandfather's trinket and inspecting it closely. He looked at the strange sigil beneath the Rothmane crest. What could it mean? It sounded as though he might be holding something incredibly dangerous. But even so, could it also hold the secret to discovering how to get that monster out of William?